Did it, the books, the bit it, the books, the did it, the books, books.
All right, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. Today, I am talking about the one that started it all, Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This book, gosh, how do I even put this? This book is the one, well, this is three books. But when I read the abridged version of this book as a freshman in high school, it is the book which made it clear to me reading is going to be something that I'm going to do for the rest of my life, both for fun and because it's intellectually challenging. The abridged version of this book, I don't actually own one anymore because I have this super cool unabridged set. Um, but the abridged version of this is, I think 1,100 pages or something like that. It depends on the edition, but it's close to 1,100 pages. And I mean, the text is minuscule. And when I read it as a high school freshman, it was certainly the hardest thing I had ever read. It was massive, it was long, it was written, I mean, it came out at the same time as the Declaration of Independence, okay? And it's written like the Declaration of Independence in a lot of places. You have to, as a modern English reader, you have to interpret another dialect of English to read this book. It's hard. Because even once you've interpreted that dialect of English, Gibbon is probably one of the smartest people that ever lived. He's using words and turns of phrase and referring to things. You have to know all the references. You have to know all the vocab in order to understand this book. And so when I finished this as a ninth grader, I could tell, number one, I had understood a ton of really cool stuff. And number two, there was a huge portion of what I just read that I did not understand at all. And to me, that was a challenge, just sitting there right in front of my face. I needed to know. And I think probably that explains my ongoing fascination with the Romans, is in part just reading Gibbon, a man who clearly had an ongoing fascination with the Romans, as we'll talk about in a second. Um, it consumed his life for a long time. Um, anybody in the world today who thinks about the Romans a lot, as that, bit of an internet meme there a while ago of, how often do the men in your life think about the Roman Empire? Gibbon's the guy that started that because Gibbon thought about the Roman Empire every day for more than 20 years. And he wrote about it more than any person has ever written about it. Um, and I'm going to argue he probably wrote about it better than almost anyone has ever written about it. Yeah. So, um, Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, or typically just called by that last bit, you can see here, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's sort of the colloquial title. If you are not aware, which I assume you are as a viewer of this kind of channel, but not everybody is. So if you're unaware, Gibbon, when he was a young man, visited Rome, and he was fascinated by the ruins, in particularly the Roman Forum. There's some temples there. There's, I think, part of the Curia, which is the Senate House, the ancient Roman Senate House. But I don't think it's the earliest one. I think it's like a rebuilt one, or parts of a rebuilt one. Um, but there are major Roman buildings that are still in the 1700s were able to be seen. And he was fascinated by those buildings, and so he began to think about writing a history just of the city of Rome and trying to figure out, all right, well, where did these buildings come from, and when were they built, and why, and who built them, and all this. And he realized very quickly that in order to tell that story effectively, he was just going to have to tell the story of the whole Roman Empire. And in order to tell that story effectively, He's basically going to have to tell the whole history of Eurasia for about a 2,000-year span. And so that's what he set out to do. Um, he chronicles in this work, which this 3-volume work, this is about what it was when it came out. I don't remember if it came out in 3 volumes or if it came out in 4, but it was this size when it came out. And the text in these, just to give you a sense, that's how big the text is. Okay, so this is not like big words. This is not the edition you buy for somebody who needs really thick glasses. So anyway, he wanted to explain how is it that the Roman Empire, which controlled the entire Mediterranean basin for nearly 2 millennia, right, in some form, why did it collapse? Why did it fall apart? Where did it go and why? And so his book begins in technically the end of the 2nd century AD, the death of Marcus Aurelius and the reign of his son Commodus. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, that's the time frame we're talking about. Gladiator's not historically accurate, but that's the time frame we're talking about. And the Commodus that you get in Gladiator is pretty good. So as a guide for the actual man. But in order to explain who Marcus Aurelius is and why his son Commodus coming to power is such a problem and the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire, Gibbon gives what for him is a really brief, and by really brief, I mean like a 60-page chapter. Again, the text is like this, explaining where the Roman Empire came from, starting, I believe, in like the 3rd century BC. So he goes back like 500 years and says, all right, well, this is where the Roman Empire came from, starting, I believe, with the First Punic War. And he sort of says they fought these 3 wars with the Carthaginians, and then they became an empire, and then there were Roman emperors, and then you got the 5 good emperors, or the Antonines, the last of which was Marcus Aurelius. And so he gives a very Gibbonianly brief introduction to the history of the Roman Empire in order to give an extensive history of the decline and fall of that empire. And so he carries the narrative forward from the 180s, 190s AD, all the way down to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453 AD, and then carries it forward even a little bit further into the 16th century in the city of Rome specifically. And so the book ends, I think he effectively brings it up to the beginning of his own lifetime, or just before the beginning of his own lifetime. So he starts 250 years before the birth of Christ, and ends in his own lifetime, basically. It is crazy. It covers, I said it was the history of all of Eurasia. It basically is. He, at one point or another, and often at several points, he discusses intelligently all of the following things: the form and function of a Roman legion, the organizational revolutions of the 3rd and 4th century in Roman legions, Greco-Roman paganism, ecclesiastical politics of the early church, the life of Christ, economic crises in the late Western Empire, population movement of Asian, Central Asian, and Germanic nomads, the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties of China, Christian heresies like Donatism, Arianism, and Valentinianism, the life stories of nearly every Roman emperor. Pretty much everybody post Marcus Aurelius, you get their life story. The post-Roman kingdoms in the west of the Goths, the Franks, the Saxons, the Vandals, the Suevi, the Burgundians, and several others. The iconoclasm controversy in the Eastern Roman Empire, the life of Muhammad and the birth of Islam, why the Eastern Empire survived the 5th century and the West didn't, the early Islamic caliphates, the Crusades, all of them are in this book. He has 3 chapters, I think, about the Crusades. So over 100 pages about the Crusades. The rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, that's a whole chapter. The spread of Christianity to Russia, the birth of the Venetian Republic, the rise and power of the Roman Catholic papacy, the conquest of Tamerlane, including very, very detailed descriptions of his wars for control of China, Central Asia, India, and the Byzantine Empire, the Turks and their conquest of the Middle East and much of the Byzantine Empire, the effects of gunpowder on warfare, the transmission of classical texts from the Greek East to the Latin West, specifically to monasteries, the beginning of the Renaissance, and the architectural genius of the Romans. And that's a short list. Like that's the things I could think of off the top of my head, just replaying portions of the book to myself. Like what was in there? That's what was in there. And so much else besides. I said it before. This is a history of all of Eurasia spanning the last 2,000 years. In order to talk about the Romans effectively, he has to talk about all the people that live near the Romans. And in order to talk about them effectively, he has to talk about the people that border them on the other side, and them on the other side, and them on the other side. He talks about the Empire of China pretty well at good length, especially for the 1700s, when most Europeans had never been there. And the primary sources on the Chinese Empire were slim, like almost nothing that he could have really read, and yet still provides a pretty accurate picture of China and India and Southeast Asia and Central Asia during these time periods in order to talk intelligently about what was happening there and how it affected the Romans. And as I'll mention more in a minute, his sort of thesis and a lot of his research and a lot of the claims he makes, a lot of them have been challenged in the modern day. Some of them have even just been outright rejected. But the fact that he was able to write something like this in the 1700s, and it remains to this day one of the foundational works of history, certainly in Western literature, but in the studies of the Romans, it is the building block. There's nothing else like it. And so he really does tell what for him would have been almost the history of the world. The Americas don't come into it. He doesn't have a lot to say about sub-Saharan Africa, although he does mention parts of sub-Saharan Africa when it's relevant, but it's really not relevant very often. And I don't know that that's actually changed very much in Roman studies. I'm sure somebody is studying that, but I don't think that sub-Saharan Africa had a huge effect on the Roman Empire. I'm sure there was something, and that's going to make me sound ignorant and silly, but he talks about Saharan peoples who had something to do with the Roman Empire. He talks about the Moors, and I think he talks about the Tuareg, and there's one other that is escaping me right now. The Garamantes, he talks about them. So just he tells the history of the world, from the Roman perspective, but the history of the world, and it's incredible. It beggars me for words. Honestly, I don't know how to describe it to you. But his central thesis is effectively that the Roman Empire fell, both the Western Empire in the 5th century AD and then the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century AD. The Roman Empire fell because of a loss of civic virtue, due in part to sort of like the innervating influence of Christianity. He doesn't like what Christianity does to the Romans, or what he claims Christianity does to the Romans. And that made the Roman Empire too weak to fight off massive barbarian invasion and immigration, and also too weak to deal with the broader forces of decay, things like economic stagnation, that loss of civic virtue. They don't know how to fix that, and then also things like disease and cultural change. So that's sort of his basic thesis. Obviously, he explains it at length. Desk shake. If you knew how large my desk was, it is hilarious. So it's massive in scope, it's magisterial in quality and in depth. I think the best way I can describe it, you may be familiar, there's a quote by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He once said that all of Western philosophy is essentially a series of footnotes to Plato. That is what Roman studies is for Gibbon, right? All of Roman studies is essentially a series of footnotes to Gibbon. It misses essentially nothing of interest or note when it comes to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It touches on nearly every aspect of life in the empire, nearly every possible or conceivable cause of decay or decline. It illuminates cultures which are not Roman in order to explain what happened to the Romans or what Roman culture became because of its the influence of those other cultures. And it provides a highly detailed narrative history of the Roman Empire from the death of Commodus in 196 AD, I think it is, 195, until Rome became a republic again in the 15th and 16th centuries, just shortly before Gibbon himself was born in the 18th century. So, if you write anything in Roman studies today, one of two things is happening. Sometimes both of them. Either you are treading ground that Gibbon already trod, right? You are essentially rehashing something which he has already written about at length, again, at length. So you're either telling a story he's told, or you are actively challenging some of his assertions or defending some of his assertions. He wrote the book on the Romans in the modern sense. And every modern Western scholar who writes about the Romans, even at a popular historical level, I mean, like, even guys who are not like reading the original languages and are just sort of like, here's this cool stuff about the Romans, buy my book. Even they are walking in the footsteps of Edward Gibbon. There's just there's no way around it. He's the guy. He is the field, in my opinion. And everybody who came after him is either saying what he said but trying to say it better, or hearing what he said and trying to prove him wrong. There are, I mean, multiple. There are probably dozens of graduate theses, which are essentially just people working with Gibbon or trying to work against Gibbon and say, yeah, he was wrong about the influence of Christianity, or he didn't understand that part of Islam, or he didn't know about this other piece of archaeological evidence, which would have changed the way that he discussed this thing. He set the bounds for the field, and even people who study things which he doesn't mention, which can't be very many people because he seems to mention basically everything. Even people who are working on stuff that he doesn't mention, what they are trying to do is say, well, Gibbon already talked about everything else, so I have to go to the edge of what he's already done and see if I can't do a little more. So, yeah, he is the first word in the field, and in many cases the last word in the field. And even today, where his thesis has been rejected, or theses have been rejected, particularly in the case of like Christianity, you read about this book or read this book, that's something he'll hear about. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But even there, again, people are reacting to his dominance in the field. It's just, you can't get around it. Gibbon is the field. It's crazy. And having read it, it is quite understandable why he is the foundation of the field. And a lot of that, I think, comes from his prep work. This book had a very modern process. He performed a very modern process for writing it. So he basically retired in the 18th century sense of like I'm going to go there. Not like I've finished my career and I'm going to retire, but like I'm going to leave everybody else and go work on this thing. He retired to Lausanne, Switzerland, in order to be away from people and be able to work, especially to read. A huge proportion of the decline and fall is based on primary sources. So he read extensively, especially ancient primary sources. He read when he could get them in the original languages, or had someone explain the original languages to him. I don't know. I mean, most people in that time period would have known Latin and Greek at the least, and so he probably had pretty good facility with those languages based on this book and having read it. I bet he understood those languages. Um, but if he didn't, there were lots of people alive at the time who would have been able to read those and tell him what they said. He would have had no trouble finding somebody if he himself wasn't able to. But I'm confident that he himself read them. Um, he started the research work for this book in 1764, which was the first year of the French and Indian War, for those of you who are in middle school and learning American history. And he published it in segments between 1776 and 1788. So the first year, well, the first year of America, and the year right before the Constitution was signed into national law, right? So he took a long time, almost 25 years, to research and write this book. Um, as I said, he read extensively in primary source material, which was new for the time. He looked at coins from archaeological digs and that people had, had as heirlooms for a long time. He looked at ruins, particularly in Rome, but also in other parts of Europe. Um, and he used what archaeological information existed at the time. Archaeology as a discipline, I don't think, really came into its own until, um, I guess, really maybe like Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, and then uh, the early 19th century, I think, is when archaeology really like hit the ground running. But he made use of archaeological digs such as they were at the time and information about them. And so he's going back to the sources. That was not super common in the time period. It's a very modern thing to do. But he wanted to know not just like what happened to the Romans, but what did the Romans even have to say about themselves? And so he read, if you're familiar with the Loeb Classical Library, he basically read like a third of the Loeb Classical Library in order to write The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He read Titus Livy, he read Tacitus, he read Justin Martyr, he read Cassius Dio, he read Marcus Aurelius. I don't think that he read all of Augustan, but he read some Augustan. He read Eusebius of Caesarea. He read Julian the Apostate. He read Zosimus. He loves Zosimus. He read Ammianus Marcellinus. He read Suetonius. He read the Augustan history and relies on it a lot, which is a bit of a problem. He read Procopius, and he likes Procopius. He read Nicetas Choniates. He read Anna Comnena. He read the Codex of Justinian, and dozens of others. I mean, he inhaled those books and he took extensive, copious notes on them. I'm sure, kept a commonplace book where he just wrote selections from those books into one place so that when he was writing his volumes, he could look at it and say, oh, hey, here's every quote I have from all of the primary sources on the Emperor Gallienus, right? And what do they have to say about him? And he spent the first, I think I think most of that first decade was essentially reading, um, and he continued to read pretty extensively as he worked because some of those sources, obviously, like Anna Comnena, is like the Middle Ages. Effectively, she wasn't born until near the end of the period that he covers, and so he didn't read her or Procopius until much later in the process. But this whole time, that he's writing and researching. I mean, he's reading so deeply in a way that like they try to teach you in high school to like read and annotate, but everybody's like, why would I bother? It's just a book. Like, am I going to take notes in my book? He took notes in his books, guys. A lot of notes in his book. Again, look at this. It's huge. And so his integration of all those primary sources, and um, he also did a lot of reading of contemporary travel logs. So if he wanted to know about the geography, so let's say the section of his work about the Crusades, if he wanted to know about the geography of the Holy Land, well, there were Christians and Jews at the time who were very avidly trying to figure out the geography of the Holy Land. And so he could refer to any number of Bible dictionaries and Bible atlases, right, to find information about that. He also read travel logs of people who had been there, and the same thing for all of Europe. He himself had traveled pretty extensively in Europe, and so he gives very precise geographical information for a lot of things when it's known. I mean, there are events that happen and he can't tell you precisely where it happened because nobody knows. But if he knows, he'll talk about, oh, well, the countryside there is like this, and this place is only so many miles from this place, and a lot of the time when he says those things, it's because he's been there, or because part of his reading process was to read, the account of some guy who traveled through southern Italy or across North Africa, or into the sands of Arabia or wherever, and so he's pulling in all of this stuff, and not just the historical stuff, not just the geographical stuff. Um, Huge segments of his work concern Christianity. Huge sections concern Zoroastrianism, Islam, and then obviously Greco-Roman paganism. And so he's reading widely and deeply in those areas as well. As I said, he read a lot of Augustine. I don't know how much Augustine, but I think he read a lot of Augustine. Augustine wrote like 100 and something, 120 separate books or something like that. Huge amount of work. I don't think he read all of Augustine, but he read a lot of Augustine. I know he read Galen's works. I think there's another philosopher that is escaping me. I can't. It's gonna come to me later when I'm done recording this. When it's no longer of any use to me. But he's reading philosophy. He's reading religion. He's reading the ancient world's version of like social commentary, and all of this stuff. He is then taking and having these copious notes, and he is using all of that to write his work. He would labor over a page of this for hours and hours and hours and hours. I mean, he'd spend like a whole day going over a page just to get the wording right. Not even to write it out the first time. He'd write a draft, and then he would just harry and worry the draft until it said exactly what he wanted to say. He's got a really urbane, really wry style to his writing. I mean, he's a really smart person, and you can tell. And he clearly thinks that some of the things he's writing about are funny, and he wants you to understand that they're funny. And so he will make it clear to you, sometimes through the use of like irony, that what he's talking about is meant to be understood as funny. And he'll quote from his sources extensively. There's in the third volume, I forget who he's reading from, but I mean, there's like a whole, I think 2 or 3 paragraphs that he basically just quotes. He says, yeah, I can't say it better than this, so here's a quote, right? And he just writes it out for you. Um, and so he's highly critical of the sources in a scholarly sense. Um, he relies really heavily on them, but he also doesn't just say, well, we know that what happened because Suetonius tells us. Well, y- yes, but, right, he says, yeah, well, you can't just take these people at their word. He does it a lot with his Christian sources. He's really critical of the Christian writers, um, especially when it comes to like accounts of miracles and stuff. He'll mention, that they'll say, "Oh, this person, was brought back to life, or this person was healed of this disease, or whatever," and he'll be like, "That's what they said." And obviously, the implication is it's probably not true, but that's what they said, right? And here's what they said about the emperor or whatever. So he is critical of his sources to, again, for that time period, a very high degree, in a way that wasn't very common. Um, he he doesn't let them off the hook. Although there are, I'll talk about the Augustan history in a minute. He does. There are a couple where he isn't critical enough, but that's not really his fault, or at least it's not as much his fault as some people want it to be. Um, so pros of this book. I've already talked about some of this, so we're retreading some of the same ground, but um, he devoted nearly a quarter of a century to this, and it shows. He leaves out nothing which could contribute to his thesis and his portrait of the Romans. It's detailed, it's precise, it's exhaustive. It tells you everything you've ever wanted to know about the Romans and the people that they fought and the people that they allied with, and essentially every civilized and organized culture in Eurasia in the time frame that he's writing about. Um, you could gain an excellent understanding not just of Roman history but of world history solely by reading Edward Gibbon and no one else. Um, there'd be gaps, and obviously you'd have a very biased understanding of some things, especially Christianity. But you could do a lot worse than Edward Gibbon, for an understanding of the time periods that he covers. Um, I've read some modern textbooks that are a lot worse, than Gibbon, and some modern Roman history, which is a lot worse than Gibbon. Um, I stopped reading a book the other day, a book about the Romans, because it got something just outright wrong, just a basic factual error. And I was like, you know what? I don't have 120 pages worth of time for something that makes basic factual errors. You could have Googled it, or you could have given it. Secondly, his work is just fascinating. I mean, there is a reason why when he started reading about the Romans, he couldn't stop. And it's because the Romans are just genuinely fascinating. Um, he does a really great job of drawing just like compelling verbal pictures of basically everybody he discusses. And that's, emperors who have multiple biographies of them, their generals, eunuchs and slaves and barbarian chieftains and courtesans and bishops and, mangy, dirty monks from the desert and pagan philosophers. I mean, you name it. He makes a lot of those people feel real, or if not real, he paints them into a very understandable and recognizable stereotype so that you can at least get like, who is this person in my favorite TV show? It's like that in many cases. Um, he tells you who the Romans were, but he also explains all these other cultures around them. I mean, again, it's a history of Eurasia, really, because it's not just who are the Romans and what are they doing. Oh, well, they got attacked by these people. When they get attacked by somebody, he says, yeah, so here's a chapter about them, right? And that's why the book is as long as it is, because every time he hits a possible tangent, he follows it. He says, yeah, so because the Franks come along, I'm going to give you an entire chapter on the history of the Franks from the earliest possible origins that we can see. And we're going to talk about them all the way up into the 15th century when they are the Kingdom of France. Uh, and that's what he does. For their enemies, for their geopolitical rivals, for their allies. I mean, you name it. He spends an enormous amount of time explaining not just who the Romans are, but the world that they inhabited and the relationships between these various polities and nations and empires and tribal groupings and how they interacted with each other. Because it's not all war, right? I mean, like there's a lot of war, but he talks about trade. He talks about diplomatic delegations. He's talking about marriage alliances and all this stuff, and every bit of it, right? He does that for almost every people group. He explains the major religions of every people group that he encounters. Um, he gives an entire chapter to the Germans. He gives an entire chapter, actually two chapters really, to the Franks. He does another chapter in which he covers multiple barbarian peoples together, like, and then the Vandals figure in like 5 chapters, and the Goths figure in probably 5 chapters as well. And then there are chapters on the Muslims. There's a chapter, several chapters on the Turks. There's a chapter on the Bulgars. There's a chapter on the Timurids. Um, he spends a whole chapter talking about the Mongols and Genghis Khan specifically, just so that he can explain to you, yeah, so that group of people, right? He says, here's this young guy, Temujin, who lived in what's today Mongolia, and he grew up and became the leader of these tribes, and then he became the leader of more tribes, and then they took over basically all of Asia and conquered China and conquered all this other stuff, and then his sons and his grandsons and his nephews, they became Khans as well, and he died, and then they became the Khans of this gigantic Mongol Empire, and then his great-grandnephew invaded the Roman Empire. And he does all of that just so that when he says the Mongols invaded the Roman Empire, you have a precisely detailed picture of who he's talking about. You know what their religion is. You understand the type of warfare they wage. You understand how they're related to the great national epic that they are trying to reenact on the battlefield and in the court. Um, it, he leaves nothing to the imagination. But by doing that, he just continues to spark your imagination. Yeah, and he puts words to events and processes which are left vague in the original sources. So I mean, he talks about, for instance, um, the sort of like de-Romanization of Gaul, what's now France, and the immigration of all these non-Roman people groups and their interaction with Roman culture. And he kind of like surmises, like, all right, well, this is probably what, the Franks would have been like in that time period, where they'd taken a lot of Roman territory but weren't themselves Roman, but they still use, the Latin language in addition to their own, and they still talked to the Romans. And Charlemagne became the emperor of the Romans. He took that title because he created a new Roman Empire. And so there's this huge tendency in Gibbon to just make the ancient world tangible and understandable, which is what all the best history does. It just takes the period and says, hey, I'm going to put you in here for a second, right? I'm going to hand you the VR goggles, and you're going to forget that you're wearing VR goggles. And that's what Gibbon does. Um, and then finally, his work is critical, but not, it's not worshipful, right? So like he'll go in and he'll say, I'm really enamored with the Romans. I saw the ruins of their city, and I thought, wow, this empire used to basically rule the world. That's awesome. And he would read about some of the emperors and be like, those people are just incredible. Like what a guy. If only that guy was, the king of Britain, or whatever. But at the same time, he is not afraid, especially given the title of the book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He doesn't pretend like everything about the Romans is all, hunky dory and happy. He's like, yeah, some of them were terrible, right? And they're deeply flawed individuals and deeply flawed as a culture. They let themselves be conquered, he basically argues, because they stopped being real men about it. Um, and it's very much a simplification of what he says, but I think he would probably agree with that. But then he does the same thing for their enemies. He'll talk about the Franks or the Saxons or the Vandals as barbarians, right? And he uses that word as disparagingly. I don't know if it's an insult, but disparagingly. He'll say they're barbarian hordes. But then they'll have rulers or kings. I mean, he talks about Alaric, the leader of the Goths. And he's like, yeah, Alaric was a genius. Alaric was wily and could not be cornered or caught. And he sacked Rome. But when he sacked Rome, he didn't burn the churches, that kind of thing. And so he recognizes what he sees as being good in some of these people, but is critical of them as well, both individually and as cultures. Um, and then he tends to use his sources critically in a modern sense. So like when we talk about critical scholarship of something like the Bible, for instance, there are lots of critical scholars of the Bible who are believing Christians, right? To be a critical scholar of something doesn't mean that you're like, yeah, this has no value, I'm just going to make fun of it or poke holes in it. What you're doing is saying, all right, here is the text that's been presented to us. What can we learn about it by dissecting it, right? Where did it come from? What is it interacting with? Um, where can we trust it? Or what is it trying to say, right? Or what is the author who put it on paper trying to say? Um, and so, even critical biblical scholars, that it's not that they don't believe in the Bible. Some of them don't, but there are Christians, Bible believing Christians, who are also critical scholars of the Bible. And Gibbon does that for his sources in a lot of cases. He'll read a source and he'll say, yeah, they just lay out for us, the history of this time period. But then he'll be like, but I don't know if you can really trust what this one says. The Augustan history is one that he puts a lot of stock in, or at least seems to put a lot of stock in, partly because it's basically the only source for the time period, the middle of the 3rd century AD. So he's kind of forced to use it in order to tell his story, but it has in the modern day been roundly discredited. It's very very rarely does it actually line up with what we can verify to be historically true. It's kind of like if you tried to tell the history of the last 20 years, but you only used like Us Weekly and People Magazine. It's that, it's a gossip column, a very salacious and murderous gossip column. And some of it is really good. Some of it's really interesting, and there are things in it which are true, or at least appear to be more or less the case. Um, but Gibbon in the modern day has gotten a lot of flack for seeming to rely very strongly on the Augustan history and not being critical enough of it. There are portions of his work where he says, this is what the Augustan scribes say. I don't think that actually happened, right? So I don't know how far to take that. In general, I think he's pretty good on being critical of his sources. Particularly, he does not let Christian authors off the hook. Eusebius of Caesarea is one where he basically questions everything Eusebius says, because Eusebius is a Christian, and he talks about the Emperor Constantine from his own lens. And so he'll say, oh, well, Constantine was a Christian. And Gibbon will be like, but was he though? Or did he just believe in one supreme being and you choose to believe that he believed in Yahweh? Um, and that's still, to go back to one of my earlier points, that nobody is saying anything that Gibbon didn't say already. That is a huge question in modern studies of Constantine, is his Christianity. Was he really a Christian? When did he become a Christian? Did he even really become a Christian? What do his inscriptions and the stories about him and Eusebius's work and others, what do they tell us about what he actually believed at various points in his life? And Gibbon basically does that in Decline and Fall. So nobody's doing anything that Gibbon hasn't done before. That's yeah. Um, so he just does, yeah. He uses sources intelligently and he uses them extensively, but he's not like foolishly trusting in most cases. Sometimes he is left with one source, and so he tells you what they say, but often is very critical of them. Cons. I really don't have a lot to say against Decline and Fall. I guess the one big thing is it is so freaking long. It is just enormous. Um, I read the abridged version of this book in about 3 months when I was in high school, and I read it again later in probably about that time, after college. It took me the better part of 6 months to listen to this. Right, I listened to this. I have read substantial portions of this, but I listened to it this time around. 6 months to listen to it, which means I could like drive in the car and listen to this book. It's really long. It is a bear. I mean, you cannot just say any given day, I'm going to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. No, you're not. Not unless you want to devote most of a year to it. It is a beast. And so if you're gonna read it, you gotta commit. It's like reading the whole Bible in a year. If you're gonna do it, you actually have to like sit down and do it. You can't be like, oh, I'll probably get to that. No, you won't. You have to make it a part of your schedule. You have to tell people you can't hang out with them because you have to read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. So that's a con, I guess. But also, it's really long because it's full of awesome stuff. So, like, come on. Um, the other thing which I would say in terms of criticism, maybe, is that part of the reason that it is so long, and part of the reason, especially why after the Western Empire collapses in the 5th century AD, there's still almost 2/3 of the work to go, is because anytime anybody in the time frame that he's writing about claims to be the Romans or the successors of the Romans, he gives you a detailed history of them and that claim. So he talks about the Western Empire, which is the one everybody knows, and it's split from the Eastern Empire, which most people aren't really aware of, but he talks about the East and West, which are the two pretty much universally recognized parts of the Roman Empire. Um, but then he also talks about Charlemagne and his claim to have created the Holy Roman Empire in Europe in the sort of like end of the 8th, beginning of the 9th century AD, when he's crowned Roman Emperor by the Pope. He talks about the Goths and their sort of claims to be upholding Roman civilization after they've conquered it. He talks about the Turks. Um, the Turks make the claim that their leader is Caesari Rum, which is Caesar of Rome, after they take Constantinople. Mehmet II, who conquers Constantinople, claims to be the Caesar of Rome. Um, he talks about the Pope. There's a huge amount of stuff in here about the Roman Catholic Church, which I get the sense Gibbon didn't really jibe with Roman Catholicism. I don't know exactly what he believed religiously, but I get the sense that he's either an agnostic or an outright atheist. But he talks about the Pope, because the Pope says, "Oh, I'm the successor of Constantine." Because there was a document called the Donation of Constantine, which was believed to be real at the time, is now known to be a forgery, in which Constantine supposedly bequeathed the Western Empire to the successor of St. Peter. And then he also spends the last 2 chapters of the 3rd volume of this work talking about Rome in the 14th and 15th centuries and into the 16th century, because Rome, the city state, became a republic again. Um, and so that can get a little tiresome when it's like, oh yeah, and these people claim to be the Roman Empire. So here's their detailed history. It's like, come on, man. Like, I want you to tell me about like the Romans, not some Goths who were cosplaying as the Romans, or this Turk who's over there wearing a Roman Halloween mask. Like, I want to know about the Romans. Um, but again, he writes so well and it's so interesting and so clearly well done that it's like, yeah, I'm not really mad. I'm just gonna let you tell me about it. It's like having a good teacher and they could pretty much teach you anything and you'd be like, yeah, right, like this is fine. I'm not really interested in this, but like you're cool, so I'll just listen. It's fine. Um, yeah, that, I really have nothing to say against it. People will kind of claim like the big criticism of Gibbon now is that his claims about Christianity being this like weakening influence for the empire aren't true. Um, that's a product of his time. That was Christianity was being widely criticized in his own time, and I think that you see that in his work. But he's not universally critical of Christianity. The Enlightenment period was pretty, not universally, but Christianity, took some hard knocks during the Enlightenment. Christianity writ large, and Gibbon engages in that, but he's not outright hostile to Christianity, at least not in these books. he gives the Christians their due when they do something that he thinks is actually like, oh, that's noteworthy, or that's pretty cool, or that was the right move, or whatever. I mean, again, he's willing to let people have, their kudos when they deserve them. And so I, even as a Christian, I didn't read anything in this that I was like, wow, I can't believe that he said that about Christians. Like, he was right a number of times when he criticized Christians, and even when I thought he was wrong, still a legitimate attempt to make a point about Christianity in, a given period or a given figure within Christianity. Again, he really doesn't like Eusebius of Caesarea, and he's very critical, like, personally of him. But I was like, yeah, I mean, okay, that's fair. It's an interpretation of a historical figure, whatever. Um, yeah. So Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, incredible landmark work of human literature, not just Western literature. Um, I would say, it will never be surpassed. Um, Partly because it's just really good, and partly because nobody devotes their lives to writing books like this anymore. People used to say at the age of 30, like Gibbon, you know what? I'm going to spend the best part of my adulthood writing this massive book. You know? Nobody does that. Or at least if they do, it doesn't come out of the oven being this. It comes out of the oven being something stupid like Eat, Pray, Love. All I will say in closing is that if you plan to read this, buckle up. Because it's long, but it is a good ride. So, that is all I have to say about Edward Gibbon and his decline and fall of the Roman Empire. See you in the next one.